Hi everyone. Today I'd like to tell you about my job market paper, The Short and Long-Term Impacts of Expanding Public Education for Disabled Students. I'm Laura Karen and I'm a PhD student at Columbia University. This paper addresses a big question. What happens when disabled students receive services or support at school? These are also what we know as special education. About 15% of students are disabled, so these services affect a really big part of the population, and understanding their impacts is really important. So what do we know? Prior work has shown that providing these services has really positive effects for disabled folks, especially while they're in school, on outcomes like their test scores or their educational attainment. But what we don't yet know as well, and what I hope this paper can add to the literature, is what happens further into adulthood. This paper also considers a richer set of outcomes beyond academic achievement and considers the role of peer spillovers and school finances in shaping these outcomes. So what's the policy change that I study? I study a series of state laws which are passed between 1949 and 1980, which mandated public schools to provide educational services for all disabled students that they serve. So this was a really major expansion in the availability of public education for these students. And I study it by compiling several different data sets, including survey data, administrative data, financial data, census data, and CPS data to try to understand the impacts of these mandates. I identify causal effects using a staggered difference in difference design using the variation in the timing of these mandates between different states. So what do I find? I will tell you about 3 sets of results. The first is I wanted to know, did the mandates actually do what they said they were going to do? And here I find that they did. As a result of the mandates, disabled students received more services. I also find evidence that the mandates increased school enrollments. So with more services and more school enrollments, I turn to outcomes in adulthood to understand what this did to things like education and employment. And here I find that education and work experience increased for disabled people as a result of the mandates. Now, a concern about this policy is that it might just have amounted to a redistribution, taking resources away from non-disabled kids to give them to disabled kids. So to look into this, I also study impacts for non-disabled people. And here I find that the mandates benefited them as well. Non-disabled people also experienced increases in education and employment as a result of the mandates. In the paper, I dig into school finance as a mechanism that can plausibly explain these spillovers. So with these big changes in education and employment, I also find evidence that family lives changed. First, I show that the mothers of disabled children became more likely to work as a result, for example, of their children being better cared for in the public education system. For the disabled people themselves, I find that in adulthood, they appear to become more independent, meaning that they are more likely to head their own households and even to become parents themselves as adults. So it looks like the mandates had a lot of benefits in several different outcomes. I wrap the paper up by thinking about comparing these benefits to the costs of the mandates. And I do this in a marginal value of public funds framework, which considers impacts on the government's budget. Here, I point out that the mandates improved employment. From a government perspective, this means that they also increased tax revenues. So I find that in the long run, the mandates paid for themselves in the sense that they increased these tax revenues more than they cost. So overall, this paper highlights the large and broad social and fiscal impacts of providing services for disabled students. If you want to read more, I encourage you to visit my website where you can find a full draft of the paper or to send me an email. On my website, you can also learn more about my research agenda on inequalities in education and labor and an improving causal inference in an applied micro framework. Thank you for watching.